The Aistana were the people of art, an important subgroup of society. These were the people who possessed special skills, talents and knowledge that was of value to society. Many professions fall within this category, though within each profession there were also varying grades from low to high levels of skill. As a student became a master, their honour price would gradually increase. Take the poet classes. Within this category we have the low-class bards, those who had neither the formal training nor a history of poets within their family, but still made a living of his own art. All the way up through varying degrees until we reach the highest grade called the Filid, those who had completed the formal training, had the family lineage, and also had a gift of flair for their craft. Similar divisions like this can be seen throughout all of the professions, and we can get a good idea of the value placed on the different professions and skill sets by the varying amounts of honour price attached to each grade. In Ur Keknarir, an old legal manuscript, the Brehon judges outlined the three factors that determine the status of a member of the Aistana classes. The first, their lineage. The second was their level of formal training. The third was their level of personal skill, talent or flair. Those who had mastered their arts and reached the highest grade were called Olufs, which is akin to a professor or a PhD probably in modern times. Now, having laid that foundation, let's take a look at three of the key professions of the Aistana in a bit more detail. The Filid or poets, the Brehons or judges, and the Cruitire or harpists. This will give us a better idea of the roles they played and how their occupations affected their social status. Starting with the high-class poets known as the Filid. First of all, though they were master wordsmiths and poets in the true sense of the word, we're not just talking about rhyme and metre here. These old poets fulfilled the essential role of keeping the genealogies and histories of the people, and they were to recite these in poetic form at gatherings and assemblies. Quote, "He was trained in all the mysteries of the various kinds of Gaelic verse. He could compose extempore or in writing. He knew the legal number of recognised poems and tales, and was pronounced qualified to recite them before kings and chieftains, whether in the banquet hall or in the battle march. He could eulogise, too, and satirise, and he and all his company were entitled both to fees and refection." Their words and their poetic articulation of them were held in semi-divine reverence. Their stanzas of praise or scathing satires could make or break a chieftain's reputation, and people had a real fear of being the subject of a poisonous satirical verse that could spread for miles around and ruin them. The high degree of respect and importance afforded to this post can be seen when we consider that the honour price of the chief poet of the Tuatha was the same as that of the king. The only other positions matching this distinction was that of the chief druid in pre-Christian times and later the bishops, but these religious grades are distinct from the Aistana, the people of art. Of all the professions making up the Aistana, it is only the grade of Filid that can reach a true Nemed state, that is, a Ser Nemed, becoming a free, privileged poet. Other professions could only become Der Nemed, as their status would always be dependent upon that of their sponsoring lord or patron. The Filid, however, had their own status, and unlike the other grades, they retained this status if they moved outside their home Tuatha into other territories, where most others would be seen as feuders with no legal status. But aside from the high-grade privileged Filid, there were several other types of poets of varying grades of significance. First we had those students who had not completed their studies yet. We had those with some formal training but no lineage to back their reputation up. And we had those who had neither formal training or a family history in the art but possessed some skill and flair in delivering it. Their grade and associated honour price would be determined by this. Now we'll take a look at the Brehons, or judges. Every chieftain had their Brehon, from the Irish word Briethimh, taken to mean a judge, but it more closely related to a jurist, a legal commentator or an arbiter. But just like all the other professions, there were varying degrees of status within the legal profession too. Quote, "There was an olive Brehon, who corresponded with a judge of the High Court in our own times. And then there were even grades of inferior Brehons, descending from this high official to the raw law student who is just beginning to take out his lectures and eat his dinners. The fees of the Brehon were fixed by law, and to withhold them was a grave offence, for which a distress might be levied after an interval of 3 days." And that's from Reverend John Healy's Ireland's Ancient Schools and Scholars, page 600. The status of a judge was based upon his knowledge in what was called the 3 law languages, and they were 1 on Fenechis, 2 on Filiocht, and 3 the Briethimh. The Fenechis related to the laws and customs of the free farming classes, the Feni. The Filiocht related to the laws and customs of the Fili, the poets and the nomadic classes, and it included the rules of poetry. The Briethimh was the canon law of the Vatican. And though we have no direct records to prove this, it is reasonable to assume that in earlier times this would concern the laws, customs, and religious practices pertaining to the Druids. The more law languages that a Brehon had knowledge in, the higher their grade, by the simple fact that they knew more and had more formal education. But it's important to point out that the Irish judge's role differed somewhat from that of a modern day judge, who quite literally cast judgment over an accused party. We might think of the Brehons as being more like educated, wise people who had spent time learning and understanding the already accepted customs, whose role it was to guide his neighbours on the best course of action towards finding an amicable resolution. What happened next was not his concern, as the Brehon had no powers to enforce their opinions, but it was out of respect for the Brehon's office and the good logic used in his administration of justice that the people themselves enforced these rulings. If a guilty defendant refused to make amends according to the judgment, he could be socially ostracised and ultimately, in severe cases, made an outcast, losing the protection of the laws and customs he had shunned. Given the importance of their function in settling disputes, the Brehons were among the higher grade of East Dana, but they were not beyond reproach. They had to be very careful, for their whole career rested upon their reputation, and their reputation was ever on the line. You see, they had no inherent right to hear a case like the judges today. Instead, the parties themselves picked their own Brehon, which could really have been anybody that they deemed to have good judgment, knowledge of the issue, and would be unbiased, like the opinion of a friendly neighbour or an elder, whose impartial advice is sought to help settle the dispute. But there was a professional class of lawyers and judges who operated in an open market where reputation and ability was everything. And in an environment such as this, naturally, the Brehons with the reputations of being the most just, fair and learned become the more sought after, and so gradually they become wealthier and increase their social status. If they gave a false judgment, simply meaning that a fairer outcome could have been found, or if they were found to have been biased, they would not only lose their reputation in the minds of their countrymen, they also suffered a legal loss of status by a diminishing of their honour price. He'd be very unlikely to get more work because, well, who's going to seek the opinion of a bad Brehon? But what's more, in order to even hear a case, a Brehon had to put up some of his own property as surety to the proceedings. As he would be essentially interfering, it was deemed right that he offer the parties some assurance as to his abilities. If he failed to perform properly or issued a false judgment, he forfeited his fee, which was usually about 1/7 of the amount in dispute. But he also surrendered the surety that he had pledged to the two parties who share it between themselves. Finally, we're going to look at the Cruitire. While all musicians and singers were considered part of the Aosdána, it was the Cruitire or Harpist that was valued the most amongst them. Their enchanting melodies were played as an accompaniment to the Filid's recitation of poems in the courts of great chieftains and nobles. Of all the musical arts, the harpist could boast the highest honour price. The fine for injuring the hands or even the fingernail of a harpist was substantial as compared to other grades. To be considered of the highest grade of harpist, a Cruitire had to be expert in 3 types of music. First, the Gaeltréige, which was music to induce tears. Second, the Gentréige, music to induce joy. And third, Suantréige, music to induce sleep.